Oh yes, okay. Yeah, because vaudeville, was okay. Well, yeah, and so actually, yeah, that's a certain way I can think about it too. Hmm. Hmm. Okay. 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 So, what is being said over here can be heard over there, which is actually, 1/8 of an old Talmudic riddle. But so now I think we want to look at a certain way that our thoughts naturally work, or at least, speaking for myself. And that is when we're coming to learn about schools of thought. Schools of thought, because, from an artistic standpoint, a school of thought is a way to further one's notion of what constitutes a sense of style. And so amplification is the term that Jung used. We can't say he coined it. He didn't coin anything really, actually, and he took a great deal from what came before literarily because he knew how to plumb the depths of the old texts. And then, for some strange reason or set of reasons in the course of his life, he was able to assimilate to his understanding all the weird, strange things that he'd read with a historical sense, enabling him to look back and have a different idea of antiquity than is quote unquote normal. Able to see the actual inner life of these images from antiquity in all of these strange and baroque and ancient texts, alchemical texts, for example, and as well as having access to the empirical work, that a medical doctor would do in Zurich at that time, and out of many more philological kind of like gifts, um, Carl Jung synthesized what we now call a certain school of thought. Just for now at least, we call it Jungianism. Oh, well, I don't want to call it Jungianism, and Jung would not want to call it Jungianism because even Jung knew that led to Jungians, and Jungians were a curse. Even Jung knew that. So we're just gonna become familiar on the wing, with a certain set of vocabulary, and so from that I'll draw, whatever stories of the ideas that they bring about, in the mill, of this particular mind. But it will involve actually an inspiring person who comes out of that style of thought, that school of thought, and I'm talking about someone whose works I became familiar with, not in any kind of like thunderous way. I began to hear of Marie-Louise von Franz. I began to hear of her in the context of reading Jung, in my formative years, and back in the olden days of the 1970s. Perhaps I'll keep coming back to that because something about that is real calling out to me now. Perhaps it's something archetypal or something. But anyway, so we'll start then with just the term amplification. We will begin with the concept from Jungianism, and amplification is it's impossible to do a one-on-one glossary type ratio correspondence with ideas like this. Amplification is a process. And so, as a process, we come to know what amplification is when we begin to amplify. And for Jung, amplification was his word for gathering the all the energies that were brought up or associated with something that struck his interest, something that appealed to his intuitive take on things. Amplification was his term for this process that he could see himself doing regularly or again and again. Which would be entering into the world of this thing and then gathering, not only just gathering information about it, but assimilating that information into oneself, and constantly turning it over in one's mind and in one's imagination, no matter through what window it came in, whether it came in through the eyes or the ears, or the touch or the senses, or whether it was something read in a book or heard in the overtone of a conversation or something like that. This, in the process of coming to understand it, we begin to have a window into the nature of our consciousness. And when we talk about consciousness, we talk about the mind, and we talk about the soul, and we talk about the heart, and we talk about our sense of existence and the way we feel existence to be in ourselves. And this is what constitutes, one of the enduring fascinations and appeals of the school of thought that Jung inspired. Or maybe it's best to say the thought from Jung, or maybe it's even better to say the inspiration that we draw from studying the works of these, strange idiosyncratic thinkers such as Carl Jung. Anyway, I began to, when I began to think about the Grail in connection with the troubadour literature, in connection with 12th century France, in connection with the heretical movements in southern France in medieval times, and the ways that they were suppressed, and the ways that they propagated, and the thought that it put out into the world, and the history of it, which is so sometimes tragic and troubling. At that time, then I began to pay more attention to Marie-Louise von Franz. And she's I was reminded of Marie de France, a proto short story writer in France, in, I don't know, the 16th century or something, 17th century, who drew from troubadour tales and folk tales and the traditions of the court and the old primordial literature as it was told and retold in the courts of the kings and the queens, which is the phenomenon of medieval times, and a certain way of style, that was developed then and practiced then, and it still is available to us, perhaps, if we amplify in our minds all that we bring in association to the things that move us most in what we read. For example, if it's literature, if it's the language arts that we are the artists of, then, this could be a way that would make sense to someone, a way that might be familiar. Anyway, I became familiar with Marie-Louise von Franz because her name reminded me of Marie de France. But Marie-Louise von Franz, of course, was a student of Carl Jung. And I believe that her book about the Grail was actually a continuation of a book on the Grail started or conceived of even by Emma Jung, the wife of Carl Jung. And so as you can see, when we it's also good when we speak of Jung and Jung's thought to speak of a school of thought, because there's all these associated figures around it and associated forms of literature. We could make a cluster of these ideas. And but anyway, so she wrote about the Grail, and it is said Marie-Louise von Franz completed a book that was begun by Emma Jung on the Grail. And so she wrote a whole lot of other books too, of course. And I will try to focus on two of the subjects, alchemy and the fairy tale. But before I do that, I have to tell you a little bit, about her, because when I speak of her in my mind as an inspiring personage, it just seems that because of the strangeness of the way that it has amplified itself in my mind, I have come to imagine, I've come to imagine that I'm hearing someone speak to me through these writings, and of course I would, because that someone then would be her, a sense of her actually, as I study her. And it's taken me so long, to be able to say what I'm trying to say now, because the writing is so strange to me. It's so technical and abstruse one moment, and yet so familiar the other moment. And also, speaking of the 1970s, one might be like me and remember approaching literature like this, Jungian literature, Grail literature, out of a state of need, with fire in the head, to draw from it some kind of inspiration or understanding that you knew was cooking, inside you, but you didn't have words for. And so when you begin to read that stuff in that way, at least for me, I have to say, it's just, it's daunting. There's all kinds of misdirections for me, because one must grow into the understanding of it. And everybody has their own way of growing as they read and as they respond to the things that have inspired them. And so, because out of that a style is developed, even without us necessarily knowing about it, which is part of our work in the world, you might say. Because we go to psychological texts and classic masterpieces of literature, perhaps. If it's the literary arts we are seeking, for our sense of insight, we go to them sometimes in such desperation. But as we draw nearer to them and continue to live in a world of time, we begin to actually learn to see them, and different parts of them begin to speak to us. It's like entering into a house, and at first the silence is deafening, and then you realize the silence is deafening because it is not actually silence. Actually, it seems like it's like white noise or something, but it's voices. It is all these different voices. Oh God, and it's like, it's so overwhelming that that one, one doesn't have the cognitive kind of equipment to deal with it. And so one just gets maybe fixated on some certain aspect of it, or perhaps maybe over time one can find and pick out a particular voice. And then one can learn to focus on that one voice and hear what it is saying. And then you can start to hear the other voices talking. And then you begin to hear and feel the similarities in the styles of all these other voices talking, you see. And in that way, eventually you realize, oh, a threshold has been crossed. It's a party. It's not just me in a strange house. It's like all these voices. Oh, and they're speaking together. When I say a party, that's what I mean. It's a convocation. That's what it is. It's a convocation. And that's an ancient style of literature, actually. Marsilio Ficino wrote that way. Plato, he has that style. It's an ancient and classical style. And I've got to tell you that Carl Jung actually, even independently of psychological thought, his references to these other forms of literature and the way that he was bringing them into his own stream of consciousness opened the door for me as a way to understand these other texts, and so as a way to be inspired by them, right, and a way to pick up and follow that thread of inspiration, and also the assurance that it was a good thing to be doing, because this is what we look for in literature, and this is what we look for in the arts. And eventually, we come to realize that when Carl Jung is talking about the soul, he's talking about God, he's talking about wholeness, and then of course we realize, how is that different from an artist or a visionary? And here's a bit of gossip, There's so much gossip about anything Jungian, but this one I know is true. His research on the mandala, and you would read the pages of his books and see the beautiful, pictures of all these different mandalas, and expositions, which, can be inspiring. It's the fruit of someone whose concentration is so steady that no matter if they're wrong, they're still inspiring on some level. But the layouts, the images, the visual images of the mandalas, there are many taken from the classical alchemical texts and Renaissance texts, and Pico della Mirandola, and all of the art works to see these things. But here's the gossip part, He would say, a patient, presented this mandala, who's going through such and such, a situation, and then there's this one, and then there's this one. So, but we know that Carl Jung, had built himself a tower of art, Bollingen, with the carvings in the stone. I would guess the only equal we have to it, which is a pretty good equal, is Tor House, the house built by Robinson Jeffers out there in Carmel, whichever direction Carmel is. I think it's that way. Carl Jung built a tower of stone, and he carved images in the towers of stone on the thresholds and strange Latin inscriptions, that he got from Gnostic texts. And anyway, and he painted a lot, and he had his own style of calligraphy in the Red Book. More and more of that, is coming out, and you see it's just such a tremendous illuminated manuscript. It is done in the tradition of illuminated manuscripts. It reminds you also of William Blake, of course, and it reminds you of old London pamphlets from the 1500s, and it reminds you of the quarterlies and periodicals in which Nostradamus wrote, and the strange script and everything. And then, of course, you see the mandalas, the dragons and the angels, and Philemon, his spiritual mentor, which he personified in active imagination. You see all of these things, and then you realize that the gossip part. Yeah. A lot of those mandalas in Jung's books on mandalas that he said were by his patients, and they were, touched in the head. But actually, he drew a lot of those mandalas. It's very. I think that will come out, and I wonder sometimes now, 1,000 years from now, if there's 1,000 years from now, if Jung will not be remembered not as a founder of a school of thought, but as an artist, and then they'll look back, and everything will kind of turn in a certain sense in the ways that we think, rationalism and all romanticism and this whole tradition, our whole history of scientific thought and philosophical thought. So he figures into it in so many ways, which is why we can only speak of him in legendary terms. And isn't that good? But now Marie-Louise von Franz, she was born in Munich. Her father was a general in the Austrian army. I think it was 1915. So I think she's 2 years younger than Hannah Arendt, because I believe Hannah Arendt was born in 1913. Also in Germany, but up in Königsberg, which might have been another country at that time and might be another country now, but Prussia, I think those borders up there, we still haven't figured those out, from a political science, history of political science standpoint, right? But anyway, but out in southern Germany, 2 years later, after Hannah Arendt was born in the north, Marie-Louise von Franz was born in the south of Germany, in Munich, and they moved sometime thereafter. Well, I believe by the time she was a teenager, they moved to a town in Switzerland, or a small city in Switzerland called Gellen. And they lived there for a while. And then when in her teenage years, she went with her sister, and they lived by themselves as teenagers, going to that secondary school, which was a good school, in Zurich. And she was, it was philology, classical philology, antiquities, ancient literature, it was languages, it was all these things that thank goodness, that there's that available for people who were following this kind of trajectory at that time. That's another thing that's totally unique, And of course, everything has its own equivalent, but at that time anyway. So from there, I think she was about 18 years old, and it was a nephew of Antonia Wolff, who was an associate of Carl Jung's at that time, and her nephew knew Marie-Louise von Franz, and then there were 8 or 10 others, and then I think there was someone else, I think a friend of hers, and they, I don't know what it was, they went on a field trip to Bollingen, to Jung's tower there in Zurich, and Jung met with them and spoke with them, and I'm sure it was a wonderful thing available that must have been a really inspiring school to go to. But inspiring schools are all inspiring for different reasons, of course. But then here are these high school students talking with Jung, or what we would call high school students. And Marie-Louise von Franz was among them. And she heard Jung talk about someone who was, he doesn't say touched in the head, but, a patient or perhaps a client of his or someone he knew, an associate of his knew, who lived on the moon. She lived on the moon. And for Marie-Louise von Franz, at that age, just a simple phrase like that, it becomes the same way that, Huckleberry Finn becomes, you read it as an adventure story because you want to be Huck Finn, and then you begin to realize so much, is being presented here, so much about yourself and so much about the way that you think of yourself, and suddenly you're reading it in a totally different way. And yet it started out when you intensely identified with it. And so imagine hearing the words, a woman lives on the moon. Well, immediately to put ourselves, in the character of this, of the character in this story, immediately you feel yourself as a child again, and you look up at the moon, and it's anything, and oh yeah, it's that, it's this, it's that, it's a rabbit, it's a person, it's cheese, it's the cows jumping over it. All of this is happening at once, and so we are reminded when we hear the woman who lives on the moon, and we see that somehow it lives in our unconsciousness or in our imagination, which may be unconscious, and it lives there, and then we also realize, but now, I'm a student of the mind, and I'm learning all these different things in science and taxonomy and classification and anatomy about the brain and the mind, and at the same time, I'm reading in the philological texts and the histories of the words and the ways that the ancient people depicted, their inner conflicts and all of these things. So I know a woman lives on the moon. There's more than one level of reality, and all of us, individually or not, inhabit these different realities in our own way. And so it opened up a world for her. I think it united the concept of character with the concept of different levels of reality, and I'm just making it up in my own terms, of course, but it makes sense to me to think of it this way. When these ideas like this are united, then, the soul takes a step into the mind, and the mind takes a step into the soul. And, and then the woman lives on the moon, and you understand. You understand it when you hear a woman lives on the moon. And you understand someone else will understand it in a totally different way. But, you get to work because now, so she was inspired by this. Jung said this, and perhaps when she spoke of how she became, a devotee, I say devotee. I don't need to say devotee, but I do want to say a student of Jung, and then continued his work after him. Their association lasted from then, when she was 18, until he died in 1961 or 62. And she had already begun to practice psychotherapy in 1942 during the war. She started then, and she was a practicing therapist through the rest of her life. You understand? Yes, and so that's the mystery to me, I think, that I've tried to come to understand, maybe through living through all the different ways that process actually becomes. So what I mean by that is she was a practicing psychotherapist, as well as a continuing scholar, translator, and writer. But this means actually that her analytic practice, we can begin to understand it when we realize, that by analytic practice, by practice, you mean it's something that you go and do and you don't necessarily feel like it, and you get up in the morning and you have to go do that, and it's got all these different challenges, and you may or may not feel inspired at that moment, but you still are there, and you show up for this. And this is such a basic thing that, at least for some of us, is something that we have to reach and work toward once the fire in the head, has run its course in the mind, because what could be more finite than fire, and yet, it moves you from one place to another, and it fertilizes the soil in a certain way. But then the process of growth after that is slower and slower. And so it seems that Marie-Louise von Franz was creatively, this is the gift of her life to us, and in one of the levels in which we can understand it, she was able to integrate what was so inspiring to her in her notions of reality and bring it into like an everyday practice of being beneficial in the world. You see, it's like the archetype, you might say, the prototype, of the physician of the soul, the healer, which is basically wisdom, which is basically philosophy. Philosophie means love of wisdom, and Sophia is wisdom, and Sophia is a goddess and is often spoken as such. And Sophia is also an idea and a concept. So, and human beings have known this forever. Human beings have understood this long before, the apple fell on Newton's head and all of this. Human beings have understood that in a word, there is this creative power of different concepts. It has in the word is the creative power of working in the consciousness in such a way that creative understanding is born as if from nothing. Once it's like, and this can be learned and studied in so many ways, and it's among the subjects of poetry and among the subjects of the discipline of psychoanalysis and psychology, or whatever you want to call it. Religiously, one could be so humble as to quote Thomas Hoare, the great meta-psychiatrist, and say, it is to be a beneficial presence in the world. I want to credit Thomas Hoare, quote unquote, for that statement. I wish that I had said it, which is not sick. It's a confession. It's anyone would feel that way, right? About something that inspires you. The ego goes mad and wants to take it for its own. We identify with it, and that's basically, you identify with it. It's always going on. We're always, children in a certain sense, children of a lesser God. But then we begin to learn more about the gods, and then we begin to understand all of that stuff in a different way. As the Zen practitioner said, once I started Zen, mountains were I started to study Zen. Before I studied Zen, mountains were mountains, rivers and valleys were rivers and valleys. Then I began to study Zen, and then as I got deeper into Zen, mountains were more than mountains. Rivers and river valleys were more than rivers and river valleys. But then I understood Zen, and now I know that mountains are mountains and river valleys are river valleys. And so it's like that with every day she went to work, and every day she worked with people, and she was the steward of the creative language that she had been inspired by and learned, and put it at the service of humankind, you see. And so it's like a bodhisattva task. It's being a beneficial presence in the world, is what it seems. And because it is of the mind, it is intangible. It is offered as a kind of like an expression of meaning. And when we touch on meaning, we touch on goodness, and we touch on beauty, and we touch on all of these subjects in a practical way, though, which is what I think is like so inspiring about what she was doing. Oh, because that's what we're all doing. Oh, so what? You mean I'm identifying with something that I actually am kind of like anyway, which would be why I would be identifying with it, because something calls to me, and that calling doesn't come from nowhere. How about that? I might have learned that, read it in a book, or heard it in the alley, on the weird radio. But, I didn't get to heaven until I went through hell. And hell is one's personal, one's personal shadow, you might say. This is another Jungian metaphor / concept. The shadow, the sum total of all that is unknown, the dwelling place of the neglected, and the yin and the yang, but also the yang in the yin, actually. And so you see, we could go on and on about that, but things become real to us in this way through this process. And among those things, for me at least, has been the poetic writing, poesis, meaning making meaning, the meaning making in the writing of Marie-Louise von Franz. And so what's so unique about that? Well, the thing is, so here's what we've got to say. I wonder if this could be true. We could look at Jung, and certainly we can look at Freud, because Freud said it about himself. He considered himself to be an investigator. And it could be that Jung, I'm not sure if he ever actually said this, people have said this about him, and I agree with it, was a researcher. That's a mundane way of putting both of these things, investigator and researcher. But Marie-Louise von Franz was a physician, right? She was like a healer and a helper because she was there amongst them. Whereas Jung would be lecturing to many of them, then they would be the ones who go out and did it, you see. So like Jung is like... and I think Marie-Louise von Franz, she always had very perceptive things naturally to say about Jung. But one of the things she said was, Jung was his just role in his work is so unique that, and this is Marie-Louise von Franz, I'm paraphrasing now. His role in everything was so unique that his influence is more troublesome. That's always true, I suppose. But his influence is so troublesome for us and a stumbling block for us because people want to be Jungian. People want to take on, and this is how she put it specifically, take on a concept of Jung's and then express it and then put a different name on it and present it as their own. And this is what she says is a lot of Jungianism. This is what is the problem, what is inauthentic about all Jungianism is because of things like this. But if you want to understand Jung, you have to understand, and this is true, this is what we're doing now. This is what anybody is doing when they're appreciating art, on the basis of art, is you want to look at the art as, that's funny. I just kind of forgot what I was going to say, forgot what I was saying. You want to look at the art in its own terms, out of its own materials? I don't know. It must have been something like that. It must have been something about having a standpoint, a point of view, a strong point of view, which is something that we cannot ascribe to technique. It's just something that we are, and yet it can inform. It can inform our sense of technique. And so, well, it comes to the point, oh yes, I wanted to say that Marie-Louise von Franz was a practitioner. She was an actual therapist. and more so than Jung was. I think that's basically a thing that we can say. And I also want to say that every creative scholar contributes to what they study in their own unique way. And because Marie-Louise von Franz, with all of her intellectual gifts, she too was on the road of the heart. And so as she began to study these alchemical texts, I'm talking about Marie-Louise von Franz as a studier, as a scholar of the alchemical texts, which of course Jung also was, and of course Jung, inspired her to do that. But she brought to bear not only all her language skills, but I think that in the alchemical texts, I think Marie-Louise von Franz furthered Jung's work. And the students they always are greater than the teacher. That shows that the teacher is great when the students are greater. But Marie-Louise von Franz furthered Jung's work in alchemy because Marie-Louise von Franz was able to perceive the actual warm spirit of the characters who wrote this stuff, whereas Jung could draw theories from them. Marie-Louise von Franz was able to actually hear their voices, so to speak, in their writings because her ear was more than that of a researcher, you see. And so because of that, she was able to understand a characterological, a logos of character, perhaps you could say. And I'm saying that, and that could be BS. But no, that's not BS at all. That's just a literary term, to play with. But what I mean by that, though, is this. There was an alchemical text. It was a late alchemical text. It was called Aurora Consurgens. Aurora Consurgens. It was a Latin translation of a more ancient alchemical text written by the alchemist Ibn Umay. And he was known he was known in the West as what was it now, Rabbi Zadith? No, it was Sheikh Zadith, and that was just because of the way things were translated. Sadiq was some kind of honorific attached to Umay's name, if I'm pronouncing it right. But you can read about it, and I think it's Umay. I could look in my book maybe, and I might do that in just a moment in my notebook. But Umay was an alchemist. He was known in the West as Sheikh Zadeth, and Hadek was some kind of honorarium, which they kind of translated or pronounced as Zathek, and Sheikh. Well, Sheikh is like an honorary title as well, but he was actually Ibn Umayyad, and he had other names too. I just want to get his name right, even at the expense of, referring to my notebook. Ibn Umayyad. So this is what I sometimes do. I forget where I put this stuff. I hide my own Easter eggs, is what I do. Yes, silvery water and starry earth. Umayl, Ibn Umayl, Umayl. And the book was called Silvery Water and Starry Earth, and it is an alchemical text from the 10th century. He's an Islamic thinker, and their word for it, for the active imagination, for the intermediate world, is the Alam al-Mithal. It is the intermediate world. It is the realm of the angels. Between the human world and the divine world is this imaginal realm. If you read the writings of Henry Corbin, he loves to write in such a beautiful way, like Mozart, of the imaginal realm, and his inspirer from antiquity is Avicenna and others of the Sufis, and he speaks a lot of that. Swedenborg speaks of the vast unknown through which the angels and the voice of God appears. Jung speaks of the collective unconscious. Umayel speaks of it in a little bit different way. Okay, and Umayel, let's quote him. Umayel, when he's writing about alchemy, there's a difference in the way it seems that people have been studying the phenomena of the natural world always, of course, and as soon as human beings, probably before they were human beings, they were listening to the voice of the plants, and the plants were speaking, and this just continued on as language began to develop, and they saw the footprints of Hermes and the tracks of the birds on the banks of the Nile mud. But then Ibn Umayl, of course, he was a man of God. And as such, his understanding of the word became a container of the different levels of reality. And this is a transition from the thought that came before. This is part of the movement of the collective unconscious. It goes through these transformations. It learns in this way, and one of the ways through which, one of the roads down which it walks as it grows is in the understanding of God, and words like God and time, and the self and love and truth and goodness and beauty, you see. And so Umayl says, understand this and you will see the timelessness, that inspired Marie-Louise von Franz. And this is what I wanted to say, inspires her to be able to hear the voice of a human being in these otherwise so strange texts. And here's why, because it's a mediating thing. Everything in it is a mediating thing, as is a human being. So Ibn Umayl writes, eggs, perhaps in no, I don't think she didn't translate him into English. She translated him into, she translated him, must have, well, I don't even know if she translated him. But anyway, here's the quote. Eggs are only used as an analogy. The philosophers wrote many books on such things as eggs, hair, the biles, milk, bodily fluids, claws, salt, sulfur, iron, copper, silver, mercury, gold, and all the various animals and plants. But then people would copy and circulate these books according to the apparent meaning of these things, and waste their possessions and ruin their soul. For Umayl, God was the creative energy of the human mind, of his own mind, and to be without God would be at the mercy of taking things according to their apparent form. It's godless to take things at their apparent form, Umayl might say. Things are not as they seem. It's not the question of, is there a God or is there not? Is God, is there no? It's more like things are not as they seem. This is my faith and this is my belief. But what this means is Ibn Umayl, because, of being a man of God, he was able to understand these texts in a non-literal way. It was how odd that what enabled him to free himself of what later we would call fundamentalism or literalism is used, the same word is used in almost opposite ways. But that's, we don't need to belabor that. That's what's happening. But, that is not our fate if we ourselves trust what is true about what we are learning about the world. Anyway, so he could read this stuff symbolically. In other words, he could see a sign, or an image, and understand it as a network of relationships between thoughts and concepts and ideas and experiences and realizations, and that to amplify one's understanding of it would be, to see, in the same way that we notice, a spider web has a shape, especially if it's a mandala, or in the same way we notice like a path in the forest, or the same way we come to understand a labyrinth as we walk it, in all these different ways. It's conceptual symbolism. There's layers of mind. When the layers of the mind become transparent to each other, this is when, the soul speaks to itself through, the mental dimensions of the mind, which are so intimately related to the dimensions of time and space and the physical world that we live in and seem trapped and bounded by, and to whatever degree that is necessary and appropriate are, and yet those traps and those boundaries are themselves words for a certain kind of order, you see. And this order is available to us cognitively when we participate in our imaginations with these realms of thought, you see. And have always been examples. And so this was what was inspiring Marie-Louise von Franz. But what she did, she turned it into just work. It's a great mystery to me, the work ethic that it must have called forth. It's hard for me to use words like focus. But at the same time, there's something going on there that enables such a great capacity It's almost like it's an extra human capacity to produce works, to produce these works of thought. But really all that is, this is just another way of saying, oh, this is notable. This is why we're, taking a look at her work now, years after she's walked this earth. But as I was saying, this Ibn Umayal alchemical book was translated into Latin, and in the times of St. Thomas Aquinas. And one of Marie-Louise von Franz's, as I understand it at this point, a landmark early identifying kind of work was her translation into German, I guess, of this translation of this 10th century alchemical text by an Arabic or an Islamic philosophical alchemist, Ibn Umayal. This was translated into Latin, and Marie-Louise von Franz, with her language gifts, translated it into German. But as she was doing so, she became very familiar with the inner inspiration of this text. She became very familiar with it, so much so that she began to understand the mystery, the human mystery, one of the human mysteries of it. But it's based on a legend, actually, too. It is said that this Aurora consequens, consurgens with surging. The word to me might mean something to do with fountains or confluence, but aurora means light, of course. The Aurora consurgens, a Latin translation of silvery water and starry earth. It was rumored, and by rumor I mean an old philological legend promulgated perhaps by monks, in their cells and their scriptoriums. But it is said that Thomas Aquinas actually is the author of that book. But then this became a controversial thing because Thomas Aquinas is intimately involved with the formation of church doctrine, and things got very dramatic at certain times, all of a sudden, quick, as they still do in matters involving this. And so somehow it became controversial, the idea that Thomas Aquinas would have written an alchemical text. They were not ready to let go of the idea that this was like heretical witchcraft or paganism or whatever you want to call it, anathema. But to think that Thomas Aquinas would have wrote it is controversial and therefore forbidden. But Marie-Louise von Franz, with her warm, consistent kind of sense of analytics, she offers this suggestive comment. And by suggestive comment, I mean there's still nothing more or less literal about it than there has ever been. But this is an expression of Marie-Louise von Franz's mind when she says something to the effect of, there is evidence to believe that, yes, Thomas Aquinas did actually write this alchemical text. And we can look at it in various ways, As we can see that Ibn Umayal his take on alchemy was symbolic and less concerned with recipes and kind of any practical elixirs or anything like that, but more with learning from them so that the light in the mind begins to illuminate the meaning of the words, in the texts and in the natural phenomena. When we begin to understand that Ibn Umayal is already writing that way. And so then for Thomas Aquinas, we see that it could be him, because we don't see in this particular work recipes to any literal kind of alchemical things, like recipes of potions or any of the kind of more vulgar kind of pragmatic kind of usages of alchemy. We see instead, we see this fervor and this knowledge, of the church and the liturgy. So it's easy to think that it was a clergyman who wrote this. And yet, she says, we also see this praise of the poor. It's like a style, but that there's also an insight here involving, the religious understanding that who had this religious understanding in medieval times at that time, enough to be able to write in such a way as praise of the poor becomes something that we're considering now. It was the Dominicans, and it was the Franciscans, who were writing that way. And St. Thomas was a Dominican, and so it's a Dominican style, Marie-Louise von Franz says. And not only is it that, but the style it is written in it's written by an individual human being. You can tell. It's written by an individual human being because of the way the ideas flow. The ideas are flowing with a sense of of feeling or of passion, as if someone is gripped by something that would otherwise have stayed in their shadow. And we know that Thomas Aquinas was dominated by the intellectual side of things, but we also understand that it is said, he had some kind of disturbing vision later on in life where the entire Eucharist was to him like straw. And this is part of his legend. I'm sure there's more about it than I know. But Marie-Louise von Franz refers to a disturbing image later on in Thomas's life, and then he was also working on a translation or a commentary on the Song of Solomon, that book in the Bible, and there's much about the Song of Solomon in this alchemical text also. So Marie-Louise von Franz says, for these kind of reasons, it is a very valid hypothesis that St. Thomas Aquinas wrote this. And so that, again, I think I refer it back to there is a woman in the moon. St. Thomas of Aquinas wrote this alchemical text. And this suddenly just gives us a little nexus, a little node of many but different thresholds in our thinking. And so it rewards our amplification process. In this way, it is, enriching and life-giving. And all of this without, who knows if it's literally true. We don't know. But from this, you can see that she's got something guiding her that Jung is not necessarily guided by. And that is like a central kind of like focus of character or of the self. And of course, the self is an archetype. The self, that's the totality of the entire psyche. That's what unites the conscious mind with the unconscious mind. It is the self. And the ultimate archetype of the self, of course, is God. But there are partial archetypes. I don't know if they use the word partial archetypes of God. We've mentioned then the alchemical. Let us now mention the fairy tale, because that's also so very important. She wrote a great many books on the fairy tale. And Grimm and Jung and so many, have all been, nourished by this form. And she had so much to say about it. And, I wanted to go into like a longish fairy tale about that, but for some reason I might just have to content myself to get away with I don't know, for some reason I just want to take this approach as of a tailor. That's what I want to do. I want to take the approach of a tailor. And a tailor, what does a tailor do? A tailor cuts and patches and presses and sews and puts together, and to meet a basic need, a clothing. And also I think a tailor also has to be able to work on the move. You might be in a wagon rolling down the road going from village to village, and you got to like put this stuff together, in a rocking and rolling wagon. And so the tailor becomes, and who showed me this? Well, Marie-Louise von Franz showed me this. That's who, through her teaching on the fairy tale. You see, Marie-Louise von Franz, it seems to me, I want to present her as a teacher of fairy tales to me, with a specific kind of like take on it myself, since, I tell fairy tales at a school. And so I have always been inspired by the people who can help me to amplify this material, not only so that I can hold it in my memory and be able to patch together from the things I remember and don't remember and kind of make up on the spot in a moving wagon going down a road, at the service of the human attention span, which is what we educate in the school. And the purpose of art anywhere as a teaching, the purpose of the teaching arts, the tutelary arts, is always to be immediately useful to someone who is in need of it at that time. And where do you learn to find where there's a need for what you've sown? But in the schools, if you're a teacher as a tailor. And so you see, we begin to, there's these archetypal like human activities that we learn to understand through the language and the drama of the fairy tale. And as Marie-Louise von Franz and many others have said, through the philosophy of the fairy tale, through the love of wisdom expressed through the medium of the fairy tale, as a form, you see. And right away, you see, we must work as a tailor. And so there's the tailor in the fairy tale that I want to like refer to a little bit. And there's the shoemaker in the fairy tale that I want to refer to a little bit, and perhaps I'm doing it in a stiff and heavy-handed way, but we've already started to talk about the tailor as kind of like an archetypal kind of story figure, or a Jungian, figure, but I want to say a story figure. And then we also have to speak of the shoemaker as a archetypal kind of storyteller. And then maybe we can learn just a little bit more about how she was working as a Jungian from that. But the shoemaker, I was thinking of before the shoemaker when I began to realize, the mind goes here and there. The patches are patched and thrown on. You work and you press and you drive and you move and you put it together. And it may or may not hold. And if it doesn't hold, then you try it again or you try a different approach. All out of this kind of sense of immediate need. The tailor is working in that way, like this. The tailor is working like this. The shoemaker is working for you like this. The shoemaker is when we speak of putting your foot down or taking a stand or standpoint or point of view. I think I was thinking about point of view as I was looking at all of the different thoughts that were still kind of in there, like just stages, like patches lying around on the ground amidst all the rags that one has to make something to wear, and before the face of the world. But the shoemaker has to do with just kind of where you plant yourself and where you plant yourself, but also where you walk, as how you walk down the road. We speak of where the rubber meets the road. We speak of, if the shoe fits, wear it. We speak of Mullah Nasruddin going to the cobblers and saying, do you have twine? Do you have a needle? Do you have leather, good leather? Do you have little nails and a proper little hammer and wood to make in the shape of heels? Do you have these things? Yes, I do. Well, then for heaven's sake, said Mullah Nasruddin, why don't you make a pair of shoes? And then, and then he leaves the shop. And then people have studied that strange thing that Mullah Nasruddin did. We know that Mullah Nasruddin was not afraid to look foolish in order to teach us something. And so even the tailor, even the shoemaker, it must put together these things out of these various assemblages, but they're very, very different in their texture and in their use and in the way that the other will use them. And so it has these billions and millions of all these associations, each of which conjure a world of experience, in their differences. And so so there they are as storytelling figures. But then what if we look upon them as archetypes? And let's do this. Let's talk about this, because now, as a practitioner, Marie-Louise von Franz understood that everything that you learn, like a tailor, everything that you learn here may or may not be able to be useful over here, because after all, it's you have to put away it once you're done with it. And so each new individual is a new take on all of this. And so it is not the concepts, that take the lead. It is the needs of those whom we see that take the lead. And in this way, there we are again. She's being, she's teaching us about something that is her personal reality as well. But I wanted to say this. When you're talking about these Jungian archetypes, here we are. Here we are. Good. This is her direct commentary upon the tale that I've sort of referred to. By the way, it's called The Two Travelers. She did not take it from Grimm, I'm pretty sure. She took it from a different collection of German fairy tales. But, there's always a lot of familiarities. But here we are. I want to read some words of her now, and we will see something here, I think. After she tells this story, it might have been her translation. It was her presentation. She writes, at first glance, you might say that in The Two Travelers, the nice, optimistic tailor represents the conscious side, and the shoemaker, the shadow, the compensatory side. The tailor, the optimistic tailor, working in the air, patchworks, optimistic, put it together on the fly, that's the optimistic side of things, airy and light and capable. And you might want to put it that way. Well, let me go back to her words now. The optimistic tailor represents the conscious side, and the shoemaker, the shadow, compensatory side. You might assume that. And actually, this is an interpretation, she writes, given even by people who work on fairy tales in a Jungian way. They take it as a typical story representing the ego and the shadow. I think this is in a way true, but in my experience, Jung might not write that, but in my experience, if you start with such a hypothesis, you get stuck. Consequently, I would like to warn you against taking Jungian concepts and pinning them onto mythological figures, saying this is the ego, this is the shadow, and this is the anima, because you will see that this works only for a time, and that then there come contradictions and finally distortions, as people try to force the figures in the story into a definite form. She writes, it is much better, instead of jumping to conclusions, to look at the two figures and their functional aspects in the story, and the way in which they are constellated in regard to the other characters, and to follow the rule not to interpret any archetypal figures before we have also looked at the context. Then we will come to slightly different conclusions than if we just took them arbitrarily as ego and shadow, Which is also, if you read what the shoemaker actually does, he does bad things, but the tailor overcomes them, through all kinds of good reasons. And so, yes, and she admits, or she says, she allows that it would be a conventional way to understand this. But here's what I like most about it for myself. When she cautions us, of course she warns us. It is, rather than jumping to conclusions with the resulting contradictions and finally distortions, implying that there's a process of that, which there, of course there is. It's folly. It's called folly. But it is much better, she writes, she gives us this, to look at the two figures and their functional aspects in the story, and in the way in which they are constellated in regard to the other characters. And so what I like about this is to look at the two figures in their functional aspects in the story. For me, the key word is the functional aspects in the story. And suddenly, I have no choice. If I am to understand Marie-Louise von Franz referring to the functional aspects of the story, I've got to find out what those functional aspects are. Oh, well, I'll have to be looking for that. And here I go. I'm going to look for that too. And that's my process of learning the story. What are the functional aspects of them in the story? Oh, how painful. The functional aspects in a story where you're supposed to let your imagination run wild? Oh, but there we are again. It's a discipline. And here is a very inspiring doorway into it for one such as myself. Someone else would read this and draw something else totally different in this way. If we look at poesis as making, and we look at meaningful things as creative literature, we will understand that Marie-Louise von Franz is a poet of teaching. We could look at it that way if we want to. But anyway, the functional aspects in the story. But she also says something else. The way in which they are constellated in regard to the other characters. So in regard to the other characters, that's the characters' relationships, And that's okay, that's their feeling and what they're doing and what they want and how they interact with each other and their conflicts and their boundaries and their alliances and their promises and their betrayals and what they achieve together and how they hinder each other, their relationships. But also I like the way in which they are constellated in regard to the other characters. In regard to the other characters, the way that they are constellated. I sure do like it, that she uses the word constellated for me, because stars are constellated. And stars are constellated in such a way that we make the patterns in our imaginations, in the learned imaginations, when we learn the constellations. So is it possible then that the characters in the story are also constellated? And yes, they are, because the wisdom of the fairy tale and I'm Novalis and some of the other previous to Marie-Louise von Franz, the previous German romantics, Novalis, Hölderlin, they all speak of the fairy tale as being like the original parabolic form of the notion of the workings out of destiny in the soul. The theme of destiny is a theme of the spiritual parables that grew out of the fairy tales, and also and were further developments of this very basic form. And she relates that it is a very basic form. And here we have to mention the way that she contrasts the fairy tale and the myth. And this is also something that she took, inspired by Jung. She, brings more richness to these notions and to these questions. That, at least to me, because this is how I come across them. You see, I come across them in the ways that I learn that I learn about them. She herself said in an interview, something to the effect of, Jung, you know, I have many passages in Jung, she says, many concepts in Jung. I don't know them by heart. She says something to that effect. And then, because of something in my own work, I go back to the writings of Jung in relation to that, and then I understand it in a completely different way. This is this is the way it is with Jung. So on the one side, there are those who take his concepts and paste their own, reputation upon them. Oh, she called that prestige psychology, and that's her coinage too. Prestige psychology. It's not even Jungian psychology; it's prestige psychology. And indeed it is. But for her, she too was. This is her way of saying that she's also a beginner. Okay, but now there was something then about. Oh yes. So with myth. But first, I've got to. Well, the tea is still warm. With myth, she tells us that Jung would write about myth. Of course, we know this in the figures and myth and the hero and the hero's journey and all of this. And Jung, of course, wrote so perceptively about fairy tale too, probably uncannily. We could compare and contrast them, and it would probably be uncanny. But she speaks of the myth in this way, and I learned this, from reading her, over the years, and finally understanding the simplicity of it. But the myth, it is an expression of the nationality and the culture of a people, and of a great many notions, chivalry, heroism, bravery, courage, and all of this stuff. Well, the myth is of the domain of like nations and cultures, countries and peoples and ethnic groups and languages. The fairy tale, though, goes hither and yon, all over through many different cultures, you see. When we learn to see what makes a myth, well, what makes a myth is the characters and the happenings. What makes a fairy tale a particular fairy tale, we have learned to understand through. There's many ways that we have learned how to understand this, but what makes a fairy tale is it's a different kind of challenge to the imagination, because that fairy tale appears and reappears in all of these different cultures and things. This is what the fairy tale does. And so we begin to identify the fairy tale by its structural elements. And there's a whole lot of different ways to do that, of course. But, and it's the most shallow ways to say this type of tale is this type of tale, and this type of tale is that type of tale. But if we're talking about structural elements and the way that the characters, as she would put it, the way that the characters are constellated, the way that they function in relation to each other, there we begin to draw similarities between different kinds of fairy tales. And then we begin to have a whole new different conception of the way we understand the differences and the similarities between fairy tales, which we have had to do because of the way that fairy tales move, and there's the Taylor kind of thing again. They're forming themselves not only from culture to culture, from place to place, but from tongue to tongue and from ear to ear. You see, and so because of this, we identify their structural elements in this much more subtle and refined way that Marie-Louise von Franz was able to present to us, drawn from her work with human beings, in all these different kind of contexts as a therapist. You see, so in no other writer, well, I'm sure that there are other writers, but for me at least, I'm appreciating right now. I'm very grateful to be able to understand, that she drew from her daily work the ideas that become inspiring literature or inspiring literary ideas, which help us ourselves to create our own kind of inspiring literature in a process that is always in transition, and it is always made by everyone and no one, because there is that of fairy tales that is of the oral tradition, just like the talking cure, right? Just like the therapeutic talking cure, Freudian and Jungian and Marie-Louise von Franz, these workers in speech, in healing speech, in the speech of the Grail, as you might say, and they knew it, and they were able to present different aspects and manifestations of that to our cognition. So there's that aspect. So alchemy, fairy tale. What have we also now? A notion of the imagination. And okay, let's try active imagination. Active imagination. So let us consider the words of Marie-Louise von Franz as a teacher now of more things closer to what we associate her with conventionally, of psychology, of Jungianism, or of Jungian, the way of doing psychology, if we can speak of that. That's the thing we learned how to do in the 1970s. But anyway, it goes, and that, I don't know why that's funny to me to say that, but it's only a joke. I can't be serious. But now here's Marie-Louise von Franz saying something about active imagination. And active imagination, she writes, active imagination is a certain way of meditating imaginatively, by which one may deliberately enter into contact with the unconscious and make a conscious connection with psychic phenomena. And so this is, a simple thing, and it's as different and as similar as you make it, really. But it's such a part of when we read, Jung's memories, dreams and reflections, where he writes of his own personal experience. At least finally, that Jung did do that. I've spoken of him as a researcher and a theorist, but he also presented his own personal experience, and it was in his teaching of his concept of active imagination, which is, it is, well, I always have to think of it being the way that I have learned to read books. Coleridge told us imagination is the condition for cognitive participation in a sacramental universe. Imagination is the condition for cognitive participation in a sacramental universe. That's a quotation from Coleridge. And of course, William Blake had much to say about the active imagination. And his imagination was so active, of course, that we have to, it teaches us whole different terms of action and existence and all these kinds of things. But in the Jungian sense, there is that which Jung presents it as an experience, on the 12th of December in 1913, the 12th month of the 12th day of the 12th month in the year 1913, Jung writes, this was his experience. This is Jung now on active imagination. And this is, as good an explanation as I can present at this moment in time, synchronously. It was during Advent of the year 1913, December 12th to be exact, I resolved upon the decisive step. I was sitting at my desk once more, thinking over my fears. Then I let myself drop. Suddenly it was as though the ground literally gave way beneath my feet, and I plunged into the dark depths. And this is Jung's description of his experience of what he came to learn as a work, a way to work. He would call it active imagination. You could call it brainstorming, stream of consciousness. You could call it, letting loose and letting your mind run wild. And it is all of those things. But I understand that they would hasten to want us to know that there's something else that is going on. What makes it real is that connection to one's unconscious. And I offer the parallel in Coleridge once again, of where Coleridge makes the distinction between imagination, which corresponds to the imaginal realm, and the collective unconscious it corresponds to in Jung. And for Coleridge, there's imagination, but then there is merely fancy or fantasy. And this is more like the personal daydreaming, play of mind kind of thing. The doodle or the play of mind, the daydream is not quite that. But I'm sure that the daydream can, become, active imagination, where there's a more conscious sense of the unconscious, you could say. But at that point, then, this is how it speaks. It doesn't say, oh, no, you are in a different realm of dimensions. I mean, people are going to probably say that, but that's not what it is. It's images appear, narratives appear, voices, are heard. Metaphors appear out of whole cloth, they're just there. It's just this kind of dimension, lucid dreaming, it is not. That's something that I don't even need to go into. There's an abundance of all these different kind of notions of the ways we experience our own imaginations. These are some of the literary ones, and then I put great stock in them in my own mind, and I do not feel that has been wasted energy, And so for active imagination, it's the specific thing of like when suddenly, one is in the imaginal realm, and then the conscious ego lets go of its previous kind of like constrictions, and one gets a new perspective on one's fixations, you might say, or something like that. We're too quick to interpret it, of course, wanting to confirm our preconceptions, but that in itself proves that we are still under the restrictions of the conscious ego. But to loosen those things and to loosen ourselves from those things and to realize, as Jung puts it, it was like dropping down. We don't want to do that because, what would our standpoint be, and yet, these are the ways that inspiration makes itself known to us through our imaginations. Or as Coleridge puts it, this is how we cognitively participate in a sacramental universe. Or as Umayyad the alchemist puts it, we look past, the appearance of things and do not take things on their apparent meanings, and thus save our souls. And so all of these things, you see, they feed into and they resonate, and we can understand them to make transparent to ourselves and to each other the layers of our minds and things. And I wanted to mention also, just in passing, there are. This too has its own body of mythology and legend. There is the scientist Kokayal, I believe. I can't know. Kakei. He was the one who saw. Was it a dream? Was it a daydream? Was it a vision? It was an image. And the image was, sometimes there's no feeling tone to it exactly. Sometimes it doesn't say, sometimes it's not even a change in your mood, but suddenly it appears, the idea or the image. And for this particular scientist, it was the image of the snake biting its tail. It was the carbon ring, or the molecular ring, what have you, of benzene. The carbon structure of benzene appeared to the one who conceived of it and gave it to the scientific world, appeared to this individual in a vision of a snake biting its tail, of an Ouroboros. And yet we can accept it because it's a science, so it's okay. Or it's like Descartes had his 3 dreams, and Archimedes was in his bathtub when it was clear to him that he was a gourd of water in a gourd of water, and it was like there is a woman who lives on the moon. It was like St. Thomas wrote this alchemical text. It's just like there are these levels of understanding where the same inspiration is going to come to us in a different moment in time, and thus reveal something of its own way of being, and thus teach us about the nature of reality. And it's mysterious, and yet here it is before us in an image or a simile or something like that. Einstein had an understanding of himself, as a photon amidst a stream of velocities or something like this. Einstein also said, supposedly, we'll have to check this on the internet, but if you want to teach children to be brilliant, tell them fairy tales. If you want them to be more brilliant, tell them more fairy tales. He said that supposedly, but whether or not he said it, it's true. This is the thing, and this is the understanding that belongs to everyone, right, and no one at the same time, right. And this is the stock in trade. This is what language actually is for us. Now let's see. Marie-Louise von Franz. There were these other students of Jung's associated with Jung, and we don't, and it's not part of her being. I don't think the gift of her life is that her personal life is her personal kind of life, and they illuminate each other. But it is said, it is intimated, or Jung supposedly said to Barbara Hanna, who was among those circle of students, who was a little bit older than Marie-Louise von Franz. Barbara Hanna, who later wrote a biography of Jung. Barbara Hanna, who was the teacher of Marion Woodman, and who said to Marion Woodman, we will work together well because only a parson's daughter can keep another parson's daughter in line. And I'm sure that was a rich statement. At least it is to me, sort of. But so she may have. Jung said that they should live together. Oh, you should live together. Why? Because this thing that we're learning how to do, psychoanalysis, it shouldn't be done by those who live alone. So you should live together. And I do not know if Barbara Hannah and Marie-Louise von Franz lived together, but they were lifelong friends all of their lives. And so we do know that. And we also know that she lived with her sister in her student days in Zurich. And I believe her sister wrote about her. I don't know, maybe her sister outlived her, quote unquote, and wrote about her, but we learn about what we know of her character, our feeling for her, come from like the words of people like her sister and Barbara Hannah and others. I also want to mention, having mentioned physics, of that guy with his benzene ring and the snake biting its tail. She associated with a great many people, and traveled a lot, as well as maintaining this, psychoanalytic practice. She said she had analyzed over 65,000 dreams, which is probably a symbolic number. She wrote about a number, and it is probably true, in all those mysterious areas of the frontiers of Jungian thought, with synchronicity and number and I Ching and all this. And Marie-Louise von Franz had a lot to say about that. She wrote a book about number, as I understand it, and she had some notions of of the I Ching as being this kind of its own kind of like repository of numerical lore and moving kind of relationships, kind of sacred geometry type things, which have always been around, but these too, are enriched and deepened, and they're, just like she said about Jung. We will continue to go into different aspects of her work and continue to find new things, to be touched upon. That she was there, quote unquote, before us, as well as being there on behalf of all the people who came before her, in the timelessness, of psychic inspiration. She had this kind of thing to say. But yes, she traveled a lot, and as well as practicing her psychoanalyst life, which she did in the city of Kussnacht in Switzerland from 1942 all the way to 1998, which is when she passed away of Parkinson's, which it is said that she did not take hardly much medicine for, because she wanted to maintain the clarity and sharpness of her consciousness, and she worked until her death. Not worked herself to death, I'm not saying that, but she did her fulfilling work until she died. She was creative until she died. And this is like William Blake, or these are other inspiring, these are just more inspiring things, not that we should, I only say it that way because when we speak of creative personalities, if we want to do it that way, there's the meteoric kind of things. And this usually has to do with like social manifestations and fame and stuff like that. The flame outs and the burnouts and the spectacular thing. This has to do with stories and dramas, which we love, and there's a meaning in them. And they do have some connection with real life. But then there are those who live a long time, and we understand the nature of their work in a different way, and we learn from that in a different way. It's not really less entertaining. It just seems less entertaining at first, but it's a different kind of thing. It's the life that we see in that sense continues on in any form, in an invisible way, and we participate in it in our own minds through our imaginations. We participate in this universal sacramental universe, and what makes it sacramental is it is the growth of living souls. And Marie-Louise von Franz, her life was her work, and her work was her life. And by that, life becomes work, and work becomes life, and work becomes what work really means, which is, bringing forth, which is creative labor, which is creativity, you see. So it's a manifestation of that. And we can learn, as we learn to see that, we learn to see it, in ourselves too. So this is the ultimate gift, that keeps on giving, in this certain kind of sense. But now, I just wanted to mention also, just on the level of a more entertaining mystery, Wolfgang Pauli, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, had an extensive correspondence with Marie-Louise von Franz, and a great many letters. And we have all the letters that he sent to her. And like Hannah Arendt's letters, it seems to me, as I understand it, though maybe not as widely circulate, I don't know, but they continue to be out there for us to learn from her literary mind, her letters, her correspondences, which from other people. This too, these are dialogic forms of art. These poetic forms of art, these teaching forms of art, are dialogic, and so because of that, Wolfgang Pauli's letters to Marie-Louise von Franz are I'm sure they too will be, will offer us an entire world. The poet builds a world for us. And this is how it works, and that truth like that works in Marie-Louise von Franz. But on the level of entertainment and everything, well, it seems that Wolfgang Pauli received, or he had many letters that Marie-Louise von Franz wrote to him, and he kept them in a secret place in his desk, and he never showed them to anyone. And after he died, his wife had them destroyed, it is said. And so, what would that mean, I wonder? Well, isn't it interesting? Let's add that, though, to her legend, because that is true. There are lost letters written by Marie-Louise von Franz to Wolfgang Pauli, a physicist who treasured them, who kept them. I figure he was inspired by her words in a way that he wanted to keep in his own secret place. And I wonder, if not to appear too Jungian, but if Wolfgang Pauli, being a scientist and everything, somehow, for him, he had these literary works, which Marie-Louise von Franz's letters to him, that he kept in a particular place just so that he knew that that was there too, that the literary form of another voice with a different understanding of reality, which had some intimate relation to his own sense of reality. And so, it probably enabled him to remember, a different side of his scientific life, and of his emotional life, you might say. This is how, you could make a movie out of it, and so, this is how maybe these characters could be interpreted. So they give us notions of their character, so to speak. And it would have been a great play in the 1970s. If they made a movie of it now, I don't know how good it would be. I think they're going to have to wait and let the styles of movies change a little bit before they can start looking at these intellectual heroes in anything but a cliched kind of way. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I see her now in that way. And we don't need to have an actress play her, because we have a movie that she made, now that I think of it. Can't remember if it's called The Life of the Heart or something like that. And I've seen little bits and pieces of it on the internet. They're like in these little short things, but it consists of interviews with her, and she's speaking. And that's where I learned about when she said those things about Jung and how you find new things in Jung. That was in her spoken voice. This is what I think. This is why I bring that up. It's a different kind of medium. It is the spoken voice of this figure herself. And so it is as if you can see them or imagine them, because, of course, the computer image is no magic mirror. It's just a facsimile kind of thing. But you can sort of imagine your way into her voice a little bit more, much like you can imagine the soul of a song when you hear it on a record, right? A record is just, a reproduction of something, and as is a video. But there is that way where you can come a little bit closer to it, because it is its own poetic form, its own kind of formal poetic medium. That's what that is. And so that's out there. We can hear her voice, and we can hear that Swiss accent. She sure did speak English as well as many other languages fluently. It is said, because of some of these Arabic alchemical texts, that she also learned Arabic too, or enough of it to bring something, into the translations of them, because that was also, as I mentioned, a very noteworthy work that she did. So, and I just want to say another little thing. She wrote about so many things. I have to tell you that we are freed from certain kinds of restrictions, of conventional understandings of religion when we come to understand, the work that these consciousnesses were doing, with their poetic souls. And I've already said, others have said this, but I think this is such a key notion, that God, as this expression or manifestation of the collective unconsciousness, the self of this totality, this principle of totality. In language, God said, "Let there be." God said, "Be." Kun, I guess, is the Arabic word, or "let there be light." Yeah, he said something to that effect, But and it was, the word was spoken, and it was. And so, what that is really, the mystery of the word is our doorway into the myth of consciousness itself. And when Coleridge, it enables Coleridge to say one cognitively participates in a sacramental universe through the imagination. The divine imagination appears to us in the form of a word. This is why literature is such a primordial art form. Every bit as much as painting, and so Marie-Louise von Franz is every bit as great as Da Vinci, because her concepts are just as life-giving, but they arrive, through our consciousness. And but also our notion of God and our notion of, yes, the collective psyche, the unconsciousness, the collective unconscious, the psyche, it moves. It moves because time moves. Living moves, existence moves, and it moves the way that all things move. And so our understanding must incorporate this, and if it doesn't, we're not creative, and then we're fundamentalists or what have you. So it frees us to be able to talk at last, about God without having to worry about whether you're quote unquote this or that, You identify with it in a different way. Anyway, so who else did that? Oh, saints, did, and martyrs did. And so there were the saints Perpetua and Felicity, and others amongst them. They were burned by the Roman Emperor Septimus Severus, in 3rd century Carthage. And she writes about the suffering of these saints, as she would perhaps about many, many martyrs. But I just wanted to have another quotation from her herself. Here's what she writes. She writes, "The martyrs appear in many respects as the tragic unconscious victims of the transformation which was then being fulfilled deep down in the collective stratum of the human soul, the transformation of the image of God." So you can say, yes, religion has brought, bloodshed and hatred into the world, and indeed that's true as far as it goes. But when you see the character of it all in the individuals and the suffering that they underwent, the only way that you can understand that is to understand these characters as it was the way that the transformations which were then being fulfilled deep down in the collective stratum of the human soul, the transformation of the image of God. How did it take place? Alas, alas that it did not take place in the consciousness, of creative individuals. The transformation of the idea of God is occurring, and what a blessing it is when that occurs. That's a transparent layer of mind, which is a gift in and of itself. But when we see it manifested in history, that's when we see the dramas and the sufferings and the quests and the sorrows, and the tribulations, as well as all the other things too, I have to say. But I just like how she writes about that, of the transformation occurring deep within the collective psyche, the transformation of the image of God. And so this helps us to understand all kinds of suffering in that way. And this is also a fundamental understanding of the nature of existence. And I want to have one more thing, and that is where what she writes about the fairy tales and the totality of what she's kind of getting at, because her vision of the total whole, William Blake, Carl Jung, Swedenborg, this titanic quality, of their conceptions, is legendary, and because of that, it attracts us so that we are to understand it, and perhaps when we understand it, will attract us no more, or attract us in a different way, and that too will be a transformation. But for her, here is a glimpse of her sense of what would constitute kind of a totality, and it's artistic. It's an artistic conception of how it could happen, and it's one that I find to be very, very believable, and I think I understand it, and I hope I'm helping that along. But here's what she writes, and once again, she's writing about fairy tales, but she's writing about the destination of fairy tales as a part of the formation of the whole total concept of the growth of human consciousness and the meaning of human consciousness, the ultimate meaning of human consciousness, even as expressed in everyday trial and tribulation and humdrum. But anyway, she writes about the fairy tale, and she says, and I quote, "Hundreds of tales and thousands of repetitions with a musician's variation. Hundreds of tales and thousands of repetitions with a musician's variation are needed until this unknown fact the psychic fact of fairy tales, until this unknown fact is delivered into consciousness. And even then, the theme is not exhausted. This unknown fact is what Jung calls the self, which is the psychic reality of the collective unconscious. Every archetype is in its essence only one aspect of the collective unconscious, as well as always representing also the whole collective unconscious. So she tacks on an extra idea right at the end in a characteristically, gnomic and open-ended Jungian fashion. But first of all, so all the tales, yes, patchworks and bits and pieces, and they become each other, then they go into and out of each other, so much so that the only way we can identify principles of differences and similarity within them is to look cognitively and imaginatively into their structure. We can identify them no other way. And then we can go to them and look at their inner workings and their inner dynamics, and then begin to have an understanding of ourselves, and also of the terms by which we understand ourselves. And it's going to take time, and it's going to take repetition. It's almost as if, extrapolating only one thing that you could extrapolate from it, that fairy tales are mantrams, that, where you distill all of your thoughts, or distill or express all of your thoughts become one thought. All of your thoughts become one word, which you repeat over and over and over in order to still the mind and enter into a deeper relationship with the consciousness as expressed and is living in this one word, which is a word of God, if it's a religious kind of mantra. Fairy tales, you could say, are like the mantra of the human soul. And it's going to take something from us. And because she's a worker, and she says hundreds and hundreds and thousands of repetitions with a musician's variation. So you are a worker as well as an artist with a musician's variation. You see, they will have their shape, and that will have an elegant side, are needed until this unknown fact is made known. And that is the truth of consciousness. That is the consciousness of the self, the totality, And then, so she's saying this in such a clarion-like way. But then at the end she says, every archetype is in its essence only one aspect of the collective unconscious, as well as always representing also the whole collective unconscious. So, also go in knowledge that everything is just itself, but it's also everything. So, the individual in the particular and the universal and the ultimate, have this intimate relationship which we can only learn to love and understand, in its processes as mirrored, in the mirrors of literature and everything. So on that note, then, I just want to do one more thing. I wanted to mention about Wolfgang Pauli and that. And I wanted to mention about Barbara Hanna. And also... I just want to mention really quickly in passing this notion of circles of students, because I'm reminded, of Plato and other thinkers, of Buddha and so many, and a great many of these poetic figures, saints we might call them. So much of the language that is so creative takes all of these different forms. And so this increases the richness and the multiplicity of it. But this, I just wanted to say somehow, this is because they're teachers, they're educators. It's almost like I have grown from the 1970s, more and more to realize, when we speak of the didactic, that's not a put down. Something is didactic because we learn from it, and so learning, I don't know, that's what I'm saying, that teaching is good. I'm saying that teaching is good. And some of these people, their inspiration is as teachers. And God knows, we need them. Even, I dare I say it, we need to learn from them. And learning and teaching are intimately related. Isn't that funny? So here's a few I just want to throw out really quick. 4. 4 is a symbol of quaternity. It's a symbol of totality. But these are just sentences. Okay, so I just want to say these are some of the writings that I have been inspired to write from reading Marie-Louise von Franz. And so truth's immensity is in any amount of it that is present. I found it meaningful to write these words, and it's a take on William Blake's "One thought fills immensity," which is from his Proverbs of Hell. And I've been thinking about that. When William Blake says "one thought fills immensity," consider this a folk tale and a retelling of an aphorism if you can do that. And if you can retell a tale, you can retell an aphorism. And if you can creatively change a tale as part of the oral tradition, you can certainly creatively re-articulate or to articulate the meaning of it to yourself of a creative aphorism. So this is why it seemed good for me to write. Truth's immensity is in any amount of it that is present. Any tiny amount of the immensity of truth, any tiny amount of truth that is present is its own immensity. That's what I'm saying. It's almost like any amount of the world in this sand grain is still the world, right? Any minute particular, this is also taken from William Blake, his notion of minute particulars. One who loves the world in terms of its minute particulars. Truth appears in its immensity, in any form in which it is present. So we need to say no more about that because the immensity of it is there in the tiniest amount. So, and then just one more thing I'll say. And that is this. Advice to myself, you might say. Admonishments of philosophical faith, I called it. Unite your soul to all you know your heart loves. The tongue shapes what the voice knows the mind sees. That's what I want to say. The tongue shapes what the voice knows the mind sees. This for me is the image of a human art form. And I was helped toward it by the writings, the gift of the writings of Marie-Louise von Franz and the gift of her life and her life story and everything around her. This mystery I've tried to touch on this evening. And so, on that note then, I must thank you for your heroic listening. And I hope that all of this continues to inspire us, in whatever way it needs to inspire us. Because after all, we have a fire in our heads. And we've got to cook the food that we are meant to cook. And then may it serve the hungry, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so I thank you for your heroic listening, and so long for now. Okay, I'm in the crowd, so I don't reappear on the camera. I didn't see the light was on though, Eric. What light is that? The light, isn't there a light in the camera? No. Okay, good. I pretend it's an eye looking at me, but I didn't see it, so it was like a transitional object. All right. Okay, well.